There are plenty of disturbing facts about torture devices throughout history. However, there's something extra disturbing when it takes more than one person to use them. If you want to learn about the most insane torture devices that required at least 12 people to operate, stay tuned until the end for even more gruesome details. Here are the top 10 torture devices in history that required 12 or more people to operate. Number 10. The thumb crusher. We all know what would happen if someone stepped on your thumb. It's not a pretty thought. But this device took things to a whole new level. This medieval instrument of torture was designed to crush bones. In particular, it had a hinged metal jaw that could be dropped onto the thumbs of victims. And we all know how many bones are in our thumbs. What makes this so diabolical is that it required 8 men to operate. 4 men were required to hold the victim's arms steady, while another 4 tightened the screws. The final man dropped the jaw on the victim's thumbs. Imagine being put into a situation like this. Your thumbs would likely be completely crushed after just a few squeezes. The crushing force combined with the intense pain would probably cause you to pass out pretty quickly. Thankfully, this device was never used to torture a large group of people. It was more of a one-off type scenario. But imagine if they had made an entire assembly line of these devices during World War II. The thumb crusher was mainly used by the Spanish Inquisition to punish those who didn't comply with their teachings. They also used it on suspected witches. Number 9. The choke. While the last torture device might have been called the choke, it pales in comparison to this one. The choke was a simple wooden block that fit around a victim's neck. The problem was it had 2 vertical holes where the victim's head could slide through. Then the executioner would tighten the screw on the side of the block, making it difficult for the victim to breathe. The main difference between the choke and the stake choke is that the stake choke was a bit more elaborate. The victim was tied to a stake while the executioner put the choke around their neck. He then tightened the screws and made the execution more public. The disturbing part about this torture method is that it wasn't immediate. The victim would slowly choke to death, which took about 3 minutes. Sometimes the executioners would allow townspeople to take turns tightening the screws. It seemed as though they enjoyed watching people slowly choke to death. The townspeople would also bet on which screw would break first, either the victim's neck or the wooden block. Number 8. Breaking the legs. We've talked about quite a few torture devices that caused excruciating pain, but none match the level of pain from breaking someone's legs. You can hear a bone snap from far away, so imagine having to stand by and listen to 2 or 3 of your friends have their legs broken. That's exactly what happened in this form of torture. Victims were tied face down on a table with their arms spread out behind them. Executioners would grab their lower legs and pull them apart in opposite directions until the bone snapped. They usually broke both legs, causing victims to scream in agony. What made this worse was that it wasn't a quick process. Instead, the executioners taunted victims, making them wait as long as 30 minutes between each snap. If that wasn't bad enough, the executioners sometimes threw in wild cards. They would randomly snap the victim's ribs, arms, and fingers. Number 7. Hanging by the feet. Hanging by the feet isn't much better than hanging by the neck. It causes a lot of strain on the shoulders and back, so the number of people needed to operate this torture device was at least 12. Once the victim was suspended upside down by their feet, the operators slowly raised them until their shoulders were dislocated. Then they would start pulling on the victim's arms in different directions until they tore from their sockets. To make matters worse, the executioners would often cut open the victim's chest and remove their heart. It was common for this form of capital punishment to occur during the Middle Ages. Some people say it was a fair punishment for criminals since they chose to commit crimes. What do you think? Is hanging by the feet a fair punishment? Let us know in the comments below. If you're liking this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Number 6. Saw torture. We've said it before and we'll say it again. Being sawed in half is a horrible way to go. The worst part is, it doesn't take very long. If the person operating the saw knows what they're doing, it only takes a few seconds. But there are ways that the saw torture can be prolonged, such as having more than one person operate the saw. That's right. There are several people involved in this torture method, including someone to hold the victim's head, someone to hold their legs, and multiple people to crank the saw. But the most sadistic method of saw torture involved putting the victim to sleep. Someone would put a pill or liquid in the victim's drink and then saw them up while they were asleep. Imagine taking a sleeping pill and waking up halfway through being sawed in half. The most bizarre part is that people believe this form of capital punishment dates back to ancient Egypt. It supposedly occurred during the reign of King Tut's father, Akhenaten. The reason they did this was to determine whether or not the fetus was male or female. Yes, you heard that correctly. They would saw open the mother's stomach and check the gender of the unborn baby. Talk about a C-section gone wrong. Number 5. Rack torture. The rack was one of the most popular forms of torture during the Middle Ages. It consisted of a board attached to a series of pulleys. Executioners would strap victims to the board and pull on ropes connected to the pulleys. The ropes were attached to the victim's wrists, ankles, and sometimes elbows. This caused their body to be stretched and pulled in different directions. The worst part is that it wasn't a quick process. The executioners would taunt victims by stretching them and then keeping them in suspense. They would then switch to other instruments of torture, such as the thumb crusher or water torture, and return to the rack later. The victim would be put through this cycle over and over again until they confessed to whatever crime they were accused of or died from exhaustion and pain. Number 4. Crushed to death. Being crushed to death sounds scary, but there's an even more terrifying way to put it: being crushed to death by hot stones. Hot stones were placed on top of a victim's body, and then regular stones were placed on top of that. Since it takes a lot of stones to crush a person, this form of capital punishment required at least 12 people. Each person was responsible for placing a set amount of stones on the victim. After each person finished, they would chant, "God damn the heretic." Eventually, the weight of the stones would cause the victim's bones to crack and break. It was a slow death, but it wasn't as painful as some of the other ones on this list. Victims who survived the ordeal suffered from permanent disabilities. Number 3. Blood eagle. The blood eagle is one of the most barbaric acts committed in human history. Vikings performed this during battle to intimidate their enemies. It involved cutting the ribs out of a victim's back and spreading them apart, forming the shape of wings. Saltpeter was then sprinkled on the victim's exposed back, which caused their blood to run like water. The executioner would turn the victim's skin into a leathery piece of material that looked like a bird's wing. This made the victim look like a human blood eagle. It was a symbol of ultimate pain and suffering. It took at least 12 strong Vikings to perform the blood eagle successfully. You can't just rip apart someone's ribs without a lot of strength. Number 2. Scaphism. Scaphism was a form of torture used by the ancient Persians. It was considered the worst form of torture because it killed victims within a week. They would tie a victim to a boat and leave them in a swamp or lake. The victim would be partially submerged in the water with only their head sticking out. Insects and birds would then eat away at the victim's face and body. Those working the torture device would occasionally flip the victim over to ensure both sides of their body rotted equally. The goal was to make the victim's body nothing more than a skeleton. Number 1. Impalement. When you hear the word impalement, you might think of a single stake driven through a victim's chest. However, that's not what we're talking about in this instance. Impalement refers to piercing a victim's body with multiple stakes. Depending on the situation, it could require anywhere from 12 to 30 people. Soldiers would gather around the victim and drive stakes through their chest, arms, and legs. The stakes were usually hollow, allowing the executioners to pour salt in the victim's wounds. They would then twist the stakes to make sure they were firmly lodged in place. Once complete, the impaled body was left on display for the rest of the town to see. Sometimes the victim was hung upside down to make the pain worse. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more top 10s. See you next time.